All right, welcome back. Let's get down to business. Today we're going to be taking a look at the poetry of Philip Freneau. Specifically, we're going to look at his poem On the Religion of Nature. We'll do an analysis, we'll do a deep dive into his life as well as into the poem. By the end of this, you're going to know more about Philip Freneau than whoever is teaching your American Lit Survey course, whether that's in high school or college. And that's partially because I'm a good teacher, but it's also partially because Philip Freneau is really a minor poet in American letters. He's not very well studied. Not that many people talk about him. He's in your Norton or your Riverside or whatever anthology of American literature you're using. And that's because he is considered, as this title down here suggests, the poet of the American Revolution. And he's very important in terms of the transition from neoclassical verse, the verse that is typical of the period of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, into the transition to Romanticism towards the verse of like a figure like William Cullen Bryant or Emerson, so on and so forth. And so to that end, we read his poetry, even though his poetry, one, is not that good, and two, generally speaking, he's not considered a majorly influential figure in American letters. But what you're going to see is, and this goes back to what we talked about early on in the American Identity Unit, formalism versus historicism versus, the great books curriculums and the great books and the great minds approach to literature. Even though Philip Freneau is not a great mind, he's not a genius, he's not an incredible literary figure by any stretch of the imagination, he's important to the American canon, and he's definitely a canonical American poet, even if a minor poet. And that's in large part because reading his poetry can tell us a lot about what is going on in the period of the Enlightenment. And you see those Enlightenment ideas that we discussed when we went over the intellectual foundation of the Enlightenment yesterday. You're going to see all of those discussed in all of the various poems, but most particularly in the poem we're going to look at today, which is On the Religion of Nature. Now, in terms of his, let's move forward here, in terms of his biography. So Philip Freneau, he's born in New York City, though he's raised primarily in New Jersey. He graduates from the College of New Jersey, which later becomes known as Princeton. James Madison is his roommate there. He initially thinks he wants to study divinity. He's very interested in religion, the New Light movement in like New England theology. He becomes very interested in religion from a young age, but like a lot of intellectuals during this time period who start out interested in religion, he later abandons this in favor of politics. And so he gets very involved in journalism. 1776, he's actually writing the Wikipedia articles and the Britannica articles. They're all going to say, and you'll see this in your Norton headnote too, anti-British pamphlets. That's a joke because, of course, Philip Freneau in 1776 is British. There are no such thing as Americans yet. Americans don't exist. He is a British subject just as much as someone living in, Manchester. But in any case, he writes anti-monarchical pamphlets. He is very clearly in favor of reform, of separation, and most particularly of Jeffersonian democracy. This becomes more clear in the period after 1780 when you start to get the factions within American republicanism between the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, Jeffersonian Democrats, so on and so forth. And Freneau thoroughly sides with the radical part of the revolution. So he's an anti-Hamiltonian, and he's actually anti-Washington. He writes a number of poems very critical of Washington. Washington doesn't like him. He calls him a scoundrel, and they have a sort of back and forth. But that's because, again, Freneau is on the side of the Jeffersonian Democrats who, right now, like in our contemporary period, we think of people who admire Jefferson because of the way that we divide up left and right in American politics. We tend to say that people who like Jefferson are very conservative, very, pro-America, like American nationalist. They would tend to be the types who would be in favor of Trump. They tend to be libertarians, so on and so forth. Well, in actual fact, when we look in the context of late 18th century, early 19th century America, those who side with Jefferson rather than Hamilton, rather than Washington, are actually the more radical forces. You'll see this later with Jacksonian democracy and the Loco Focos as well, which becomes very important to understanding Hawthorne. But in any case, those guys, they're on the most radical edge of the Enlightenment. They're in favor of the French Revolution, strong supporters of the French Revolution. They are in favor of a society of smallholders, a primarily agrarian society, a very, very libertarian society with no standing army, no what do you want to say, big state apparatus. And that's considered just taking Enlightenment ideas to their most radical conclusions of we want absolute liberty, absolute equality of opportunity, and absolute fraternity and brotherhood of man, and this sort of system of decentralized government of agrarian smallholders is what's going to allow this to happen. Whereas Washington and Hamilton, they want to turn America into something like a democratic version of a European nation state. Not that the nation state is like fully existent in the European context yet, but they envision America being like a democratic version of France in the early 18th century, prior to the French Revolution. They say we won't have a king, but we do want to have a standing army. We do want to have a bank. We do want to have centralized apparatus. We want to have manufacturing, and we want to build a sort of strong national power. While the Jeffersonian Democrats object to this, Philip Freneau is very much against this, and he's on this more radical side. And also in terms of religion as well, and this is going to come out in On the Religion of Nature, he is very, very much a deist. In fact, probably goes a little bit beyond deism, as you're going to see. He is in every possible way against organized religion and on that sort of more atheistic radical fringe of the Enlightenment that you see in Jefferson. Jefferson, for all intents and purposes, was an atheist. If you don't know, Jefferson actually rewrote the Bible. You can go look this up, the Jefferson Bible, to take out all the miracles, to take out what he saw as, and here's the key word for the Enlightenment, superstition. Anything that was superstitious, that could not be explained by way of pure reason, was taken out of the Bible. And Jefferson's reason for this is he believes that Jesus had certain moral teachings that were useful, but that Jesus was not God, that Jesus was not special in some way, that Jesus had useful things to say the way Confucius or Buddha had useful things to say. He's just another wisdom figure. There's nothing sacred or special about him. And so we're going to rewrite the Bible to make it in conformity with right reason, with the Enlightenment, and with nature. Freneau is definitely on the side of that, as you're going to see in the poem. In any case, he gets involved in politics. 1778, he actually joins the militia. He gets captured. He spends 6 weeks in a prison ship. He actually writes a pretty interesting poem about that we may look at later. Now, moving forward, he gets very involved in journalism in the period after the Revolution. He establishes a journalistic publication called the National Gazette in Philadelphia in support of Jeffersonian democracy. At this point, he's already had, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit. At this point, he's already had 2 publications of his poetry, 2 full books of poetry, and he's going to use the National Gazette to spur his journalistic career, but also to publish poetry, because during this period, this is something that was addressed in the lecture on the intellectual foundations of the Enlightenment, American poetry is not primarily for publication, nor is it primarily circulated in coterie the way that is done in Europe. The places where you're going to find a lot of poetry are as incidental attachments to things like almanacs, to journalistic publications, so on and so forth. It's poetry added in to spice something up, but it's not poetry consumed for the sake of poetry yet. That'll come later in the 19th century. In any case, he, as I mentioned, attacks federalism, attacks Washington. In the year 1800, he retires to his farm. The sort of idea of being a Cincinnatus, that was always what they called Washington, was the modern Cincinnatus, the American Cincinnatus. He retires to his farm, and he decides he's just going to dedicate himself to writing poetry and writing journalism. He produces a lot of this. And he's remembered today for being a key poet of the American Enlightenment, but also for having proto-romantic tendencies. And we'll see that in some of the later works. And in fact, some of that will actually show up today in the poem we're going to read, which is On the Religion of Nature. It's quite a short poem, so I'm going to read it through, and then we'll do a stanza-by-stanza breakdown and analysis. So this is Philip Freneau on the Religion of Nature. The power that gives with liberal hand the blessings man enjoys while here, and scatters through a smiling land the abundant products of the year, the power of nature, ever blessed, bestowed religion with the rest. Born with ourselves, her early sway inclines the tender mind to take the path of right, fair virtue's way its own felicity to make. This universally extends, and leads to no mysterious ends. Religion, such as nature taught, with all divine perfection suits. Had all mankind this system sought, sophists would cease their vain disputes, and from this source would nations know all that can make their heaven below. This deals not curses on mankind, or dooms them to perpetual grief. If from its aid no joys they find, it damns them not for unbelief. Upon a more exalted plan, creatress nature dealt with man. Joy to the day when all agree on such grand systems to proceed, from fraud, design, and error free, and which to truth and goodness lead. Then persecution will retreat, and man's religion be complete. Good. So that's on the religion of nature. You can see it's not a particularly sophisticated poem. Very simple metrically. The rhyme scheme, I believe, it's just you got A, B, A, B, and then you've got a series of rhyming couplets. So you see at the end, very, very simple. He's not doing anything super sophisticated poetically. It's not doggerel. It's just sort of standard run-of-the-mill poetry. Nothing super interesting, nothing super bad. 5 stanzas. And hopefully you figured this out. The central idea of the poem is, what is religion as seen from the perspective of nature? So going back to what we talked about as the Enlightenment being a reactionary movement against Puritanism, you see that the idea of nature for the Puritans is nature is fallen, nature is evil, nature is not to be trusted. Nature is not to be trusted. And you'll see this again when we get to Orestes Bronson, very, very famous reactionary Catholic figure, anti-transcendentalism, middle of the 19th century. Bronson, recuperating some of this Puritanism, he actually grew up Congregationalist. And so that sort of, what do you want to say, that anti-nature sentiment comes into his Catholicism. He very much says, nature is a prison house. We can't reform nature, trust nature not. That's very similar to what the Puritans say, where it's like, look, who lives out in nature? The Native Americans, who are savages, who worship demons. We have a healthy fear of nature. We don't trust human nature because it's fallen. We don't trust nature out there because it's a representation of all the things that we fear. And for that reason, we rely more on grace. We rely more on revelation. And so that's where religion comes from. It's a religion not of nature, but of revelation. Well, in the Enlightenment, the central presupposition that's going to guide all Enlightenment thought is this idea that human beings are born rational and human beings are born innately good, that they are not born with the stain of the fall. Because if you discard revelation, why would you believe that human beings are fallen? If revelation is not true, if the Christian dogma is not correct, if you're just sort of discarding it whole cloth, well, then you're going to say, no, human beings are actually inclined towards good or are innately good. And so this is the presupposition of the Enlightenment. And the idea that Philip Freneau is getting at here is, if we take this to be true, that human beings are inclined to be good, that's in their nature, we could, what do you want to say, construct an entire religious system based on reason and based on following nature. And the idea for all the Enlightenment figures is that those two things are the same. Following nature is rational. The study of nature is rational. Nature is organized logically. It has a logos, hence the fact that there are natural laws, that there are mathematical laws that govern the universe, physics, so on and so forth. And so if we study the logos of nature, we will come to be more like ourselves because human beings are rational. And so the following of nature is seen to be an inherently good thing. It leads towards virtue. Whereas for a Puritan, they would say, no, the following of our nature, which is itself sinful, is actually just going to lead to the sowing of more sin. It will lead to more corruption, more decadence, more impurity. Instead of following nature, we have to follow grace. We have to follow revelation that goes beyond nature, both human nature and the sort of external nature that we see in our day-to-day environment. Now, what's Philip Freneau going to say here? So we look at the first stanza. The power that gives with liberal hand the blessings man enjoys while here. So he's talking about a power. And notice, this is a key idea in deism. You will never see a deist talk about God with a capital G, nor will you see a deist talk about Christ or the Holy Spirit or anything that's going to identify God with being a specifically Christian God. For example, Ben Franklin, you'll see this in the autobiography when we get to it, he wakes up in the morning and he says, I will address powerful goodness. I will wake up and I will address powerful goodness. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, I am going to pray. Why? If he were praying, that would imply that God is hearing his prayers and that there is some sort of relationship between God and man in human history. Franklin's a deist. Franklin doesn't believe in that. He believes God created the universe. God is not in any way connected to human beings. He doesn't hear your prayers, so on and so forth. He doesn't interact with the universe. And so Franklin just wakes up and reminds himself that there is a powerful goodness, that there's an unmoved mover, that there's a creator, that there's a divine watchmaker, whatever you want to say. And so here, what are we going to get from Freneau? You have this absolute power that exists that with liberal hand, notice this is a metaphor, he doesn't mean it literally, with liberal hand, meaning generously, he gives us different blessings. He created the universe such that there are blessings. And so he scatters all of these blessings through a smiling land, the abundant products of the year, meaning agriculture, water, the sort of good things of the earth that come from where? That come from nature. The power of nature ever blessed bestowed religion with the rest. And hopefully you figured out the sort of grammar and syntax of that here. The rest is, or rather are, the other blessings. So food, water, shelter, all the blessings that nature gives us. We also get from nature religion. This is the thesis of the first stanza. So that if we follow nature, we will be given religion. That religion is a good thing, and that religion, just as in for our material needs, right? If I want to satisfy my material needs, I get hungry, I follow my nature, I hunt, I use reason and interact with nature in such a way, right? The sort of Minecraft use of nature, whereby I hunt a deer, I eat the venison, I use the deer skin to clothe myself, I make shelter, so on and so forth. Well, if I follow nature in the higher things, going beyond the material, I will have a religion of nature. This is what Philip Freneau is claiming. Born with ourselves, her early sway. Now notice right here, who is the her? I always point this out to my students because he's going to say something quite controversial later. Well, it's Mother Nature. Now, he's not using the term Mother Nature, but he is being pretty consistent with the way nature is personified in the West, with personifying nature as a woman. And so she is born with us, meaning we are born with nature, a rational nature inside of us, and that the universe into which we are born is governed by nature, that God, the divine watchmaker, sets all the physics, he programs all the mathematical laws of the universe, and we have nature in both the microcosm and the macrocosm. There is nature governing myself, and there is nature governing the universe. So born with ourselves, her early sway inclines the tender mind to take the path of right. Innate goodness of human beings. So the baby experiences the influence of nature, and his tender mind, meaning innocent, young, not experienced, will be moved to take the path of right, the path of virtue, to take ethically correct action by way of nature. And so the idea is we can use reason to determine right and wrong. Whereas a Puritan would say that's impossible. You can't use reason to determine right and wrong. Right and wrong can only be determined from one place, which is biblical revelation. So you notice, on one extreme, all of our ethical truths come from revelation. We cannot rely on human reason. And then the opposite, human reason is actually the source of all of our ethical beliefs. Okay? So moving from opposite to opposite, as we've talked about in intellectual history. Fair virtue's way its own felicity. Its own felicity to make. And so, I think that was a misspelling in the place I copied this from. But felicity means happiness. And so the idea is if we follow nature, if we follow reason, we will act ethically. But acting ethically also conduces to human happiness. This is the Enlightenment idea, is that it's going to lead to happiness for the individual and happiness for the society. You'll see that, for example, in Mill and Bentham, when we talk about utilitarianism, that's a whole ethical system, consequentialism, whereby acting correctly leads to happiness for humanity as a whole, with happiness being the end goal. I don't think a Puritan would say happiness on this earth is the end goal. In any case, the idea here is you follow nature, you will be virtuous, virtue will make you happy. This universally extends to all human beings, the brotherhood of man, and leads to no mysterious ends. Why no mysterious ends? We're not dealing with anything supernatural. We're not dealing with anything pertaining to faith. Rather, we are dealing with things that can be known by way of reason and reason alone. Continuing forward, religion, such as nature taught, with all divine perfection suits. Had all mankind the system sought, sophists would cease their vain disputes. So the idea is real divine perfection comes from following this religion of nature. And the reason human beings have conflict is because they don't follow the religion of nature. So the idea is intolerance is the source of all of mankind's problems. Like a very trite Enlightenment canard that gets repeated today by modern atheists who, I think, like there are atheists who obviously are anti-Enlightenment in many ways, but most modern atheists, when you look at their objections to Christianity, Islam, whatever religious system, they're rooted in the Enlightenment. Like most atheists believe that there is such a thing as objective right and wrong, that there are ethically correct actions, and they make the claim that actually being an atheist allows you to be ethical. Now, I would say they have a dilemma in saying, okay, well, where do you determine right and wrong? Why should I believe, for example, if you're going to say right and wrong come from following nature, the study of nature, from the rational order of the universe, I would make the claim, well, why should I believe the universe is rational? That, to me, seems like a leap of faith. It doesn't seem intuitive to me that the universe is logical, that it's rational. That seems like something you accept as an a priori truth, as a presupposition that is adopted by way of faith. And in fact, I think many beliefs that atheists have are adopted by way of faith, but we're not going to get into that too much here. What Freneau is trying to say is, basically, we have all this human conflict as a result of the fact that we are intolerant and that we don't follow the religion of nature. Rather, we follow the religions of revelation and of superstition. And so that causes sophists, right, people who use words or abuse words for personal profit, to dispute and create human conflicts. And so if we were to study nature, what would happen? And from this source would nations know all that can make their heaven below. This source being, of course, nature. And so if we study nature, we will be able to turn this earth not into a place of conflict, but rather as a sort of paradise. Like, things will just keep getting better and better. And notice all the enlightenment and valence there. The idea is what? That human beings are perfectible, that human institutions are perfectible, and that things are just going to get better and better. That's Whig historiography. That over time, we're just going to get smarter, we're just going to get more perfect, we're just going to get more, what do you want to say, just, egalitarian, we're going to have more and more liberties, and life is just going to get better and better if we follow the religion of nature. It will allow for essentially paradise on earth. Whereas in the medieval period, people saw injustices. So, for example, maybe there's a bad king, or your lord is a bad lord, or maybe there's a corrupt priest. And of course, if there was a means to remedy that, they would. But if there was no means to remedy it, they would say, well, of course, this life is not perfectly just. These are the consequences of the fall. But Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. He will give everyone their just deserts. And there will finally be a reign of justice, and there'll be heaven on earth, right? There'll be the new heaven and the new earth. We will get to go back to a restored version of paradise. Everything is going to be great. Everything's going to be beautiful. There'll be no more tears. But the idea for a medieval of having heaven on earth is ridiculous. There's never going to be a utopia. Whereas in the modern period, starting with St. Thomas More, you start to get the idea that maybe there can be a utopia on earth. Now, some people say St. Thomas More's utopia not good place, but rather no place. He's making a satire that this could not happen on earth. I'm not so sure of that. But in any case, the modern idea of utopia really does come, as an outgrowth of leaving behind Christendom and the Christian worldview and the Christian system. And Philip Freneau, certainly a part of that in the Enlightenment, the sort of peak period of entering into the modern, he's going to say we can have heaven on earth through following nature. This deals not curses on mankind or dooms them to perpetual grief. So religion says if you don't follow religion, you're going to go to hell. What does Philip Freneau say? That's actually not the case. If you don't follow the religion of nature, you're just going to be unhappy, but there's no eternal punishment or damnation. If from its aid no joys they find, it damns them not for unbelief. Upon a more exalted plan, creatress, nature dealt with man. So not creator, but creatress. So I love to joke with my students. Philip Freneau had the idea that God was a woman long before Lana Del Rey. Okay, he's just saying here, nature gendered female, nature created the world. So there's not you have the divine nature of the watchmaker, of the God of Deism, and from that nature the world is produced, you could say, as a sort of emanation and follows, the innate reason or rationality of goodness of the Creator. So the Creator is good, the Creator is rational, therefore his creation is also going to be good, it is also going to be rational. There's no fall. Why? We don't believe in revelation. And so we can study nature and through that come to understand the goodness and the rationality of the Creator. Good. Last stanza, joy to the day. Notice the repetition. You have, joy here. Now you have joy here. Joy to the day when all agree on such grand systems to proceed. So happy will be the day when we can all agree on the religion of nature. From fraud, design, and error free, and which to truth and goodness lead. Then persecution will retreat and man's religion be complete. So we'll have the end of war, we'll have the end of intolerance, we'll have the end of religious persecution. We will all be part of one universal brotherhood of man, which believes in following nature and following reason in order to come to conclusions about how to live a happy life, how to live a virtuous life. Hopefully what you can see here is the poetry, not that interesting, not that good, but extremely reflective and indicative of the Enlightenment worldview, especially on the more radical ends, right? The Jeffersonian, more radical side of the Enlightenment, which, by the way, worth noting, is a minority, okay? Even in this period of like early 19th century, late 18th century, most Americans are not deists. Now, the Americans that matter, the Americans with social capital, the Americans with financial capital, the Americans with political power, so on and so forth, they're almost exclusively going to be deists. But the overwhelming majority of Americans do not believe in this idea of the religion of nature. But what you're going to see is these ideas start to trickle down to the masses after a period of about 50 to 100 years. And if you look today, I don't think most people don't think precisely this way, but I think you can see there's a lot of continuity between what Philip Freneau is saying, which for the time was very radical, and the way many people think today in terms of religious difference, intolerance, reason, ethical norms, so on and so forth. Hopefully you found this interesting and enlightening, no pun intended. We are going to continue the next couple days looking at a couple more Philip Freneau poems from the Norton Anthology. If you have questions, leave them down below. Please give a like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot. And also, I would be remiss if I did not mention, I have 2 programs you may be interested in. You can take a look at them in the description. One is How to Graduate College in 2 Years. It's a whole program that outlines with an ebook, with plans, with courses, with all these different materials, how you can graduate college on an accelerated timeline, which is something that I myself did. You probably know this. I graduated from college at the age of 19. I got into a PhD program at the age of 20. I can help you replicate that with the program. The link is down below. And I've got a second course in the intellectual life, habits and disciplines for intellectuals. It's really awesome. It's got 22 different parts, fully developed with videos, with exercises, telling you basically everything that I wish someone had told me at 15 about what it means to be an intellectual and how to structure your day-to-day life in such a way that you can maximize your intellectual growth. Good. Hopefully you find all that interesting. Again, any questions, leave them down below in the comments. Take care, and I will see you all around.